morning. I'd like to welcome you to the AICP Exam Prep Functional Areas of Practice session this morning. I'm going to go over quite a bit of housekeeping information to start us off this morning and hopefully get some questions answered before they're asked. For starters, if you have not downloaded today's slides, they are available on the PA chapter website. The location is noted at the bottom of the slide. If you can't use the link and you go to the PA chapter homepage, you go under the career heading and then AICP exam page, and the slides are about halfway down. In that same location, we also have the slides from last week. So if you're looking for those, they are right there as well. If you're looking for the location of the recording from last week, that has not yet been posted to the Utah chapter site, but it should be in the next few days. The recording was successful. And we have, I believe on the last slide in today's session, we do have the specific location for that on the Utah chapter site. A couple more housekeeping items. There are 400 of you today registered, so we do have to mute the attendees, but you can submit your questions through the GoToWebinar menu. And just so you know, you can submit that question. It comes in privately to us, and when we answer, we can either answer for everyone. If it's a generic question about where something's located, we'll answer out to everyone, so everyone gets the benefit of the answer, or we can answer to you privately. We will stop at a couple of points and verbally go through questions as well. If you do have any technical problems, you can try us. It might be quicker to call the 800 number. I think last week people were generally very successful. I believe we had one person who completely couldn't log on. If you have an issue like that, sometimes actually changing computers can be helpful. So that's something I have found myself, that sometimes one computer just doesn't seem to work well with the GoToWebinar system for whatever reason. All right, I believe that is all of our housekeeping information, so I will go ahead and start in on the session. I am Susan Elks. I'm the Professional Development Officer with the Pennsylvania chapter of APA. Joining me today will be Dave McFarland. He will actually be doing the bulk of the presentation today. Are you with us, Dave? I see you.
I'm here.
Dave is here. All right. These sessions are part of the overall series that the Ohio chapter actually started organizing a few years ago. At that point in time, it was focused on certification maintenance training purposes. This year, the North Carolina chapter had the idea that we should start including AICP exam prep. So we are now, this is the first series that has focused on that. Last week was the first session that was provided an exam overview and also talked about spatial planning. This week we're focusing on functional areas, and next week will be public participation and social justice. And then the topic headings will continue through the end of March. Again, I'm with the Pennsylvania chapter. Specifically, the Professional Development Committee is working on that. I chair that committee, and Dave is a longtime member of that. In addition to North Carolina, the other chapters assisting with this series on exam prep are Illinois, Maryland, and then North Carolina and Pennsylvania. Someone has a question that I do want to address this one, and I'll address it later as well. Last week there was discussion, and we recommended that people look at APA for the top 25 list, and I looked quite a bit online and could not come up with those. I have been able to get a hard copy of them, and I'm checking with APA to see if it's possible for the Pennsylvania chapter to simply scan those in, make them a PDF, and put them up on our website so they're available to people. So if that is successful, we're going to put the top 25s up on the PA chapter website. That's a resource that we just generally recommend for people. So I'm going to hand things off now to Dave McFarland. Dave is the planning director at the Blair County Planning Commission out in more western Pennsylvania. He is also a longtime member of the Professional Development Committee for the Pennsylvania chapter, and in that role has presented more on this topic than I have even, and also was one of the main authors of the PA chapter's study notes that are available on our website. So Dave has plenty of experience on this, and so I'm going to pass off things to him. And Dave, you can get your slides up. Do you want to expand them across your screen?
They should be, aren't they? I'm showing full screen here.
Maybe my screen's just big. It's not taking up all my screen, but it's big anyway.
All right. Is the entire thing legible?
Yes.
Okay. Then we'll go with that.
Okay. Yes, it works.
Right.
Okay. Take over, Dave.
Okay. Off we go. The agenda today is the functional areas of practice. It's 25% of the overall exam consideration. That being said, you will notice as you proceed through the different topics of your study that there's a lot of overlap between the functional areas and the other areas that come up on the exam outline. And that's what this paragraph states. The overlap is deliberate. The functional areas, if you think of them as the foundation of knowledge, and then you also have a foundation of experience, the exam expects you to be able to take those two foundations and apply them to the situations that you're presented with on the exam. The other side of the exam is a couple quickie give-me type questions that also come out of this functional area that very simple questions that you just real quick go up and answer and move on. You always need to keep the other areas, the plan making, public participation, social justice, ethics, sometimes law in the back of your mind. Whenever you're reviewing, especially a process question on the exam, and sometimes they'll set these up that they'll set up the situation, and then the next 4 or 5 questions will all relate back to that situation, and they're all tied together. There it goes. Got a little nervous there. Didn't want to switch on me. All right. This is simply a list of all the functional areas of practice that APA has listed out. We will not be covering every one of these in detail today for a number of reasons. The primary one of which is many of them will be also covered in subsequent topics. The other of which is a time limitation that obviously we're not going to be able to do all this justice today. The other aspect of this is we will be combining some of these ideas into one. So as we go through, you'll see it. But if you understand your basic, your history, your law, your theory, terminology, and then how to, again, wrap them together with your knowledge and your experience and apply them in your real life experience, you should be all right. Also, as we go through this list, some of these slides you'll sit there and wish I'd get on with it already because you already know this, and there's other slides that you may end up looking at slack-jawed, not realizing that's within the scope. The first set of slides, the first kind where you're wanting me to move on, obviously that's an area you don't need to worry about focusing too much study time on. If it's something that you're not so familiar with, you're wondering why this is on the exam, you didn't realize this is part of the scope of planning, that's an area where you need to focus on and focus your study accordingly. But this is a list, an overview of the different areas of functional practice that we'll be looking at.
Dave, if you could speak up just a little bit. We have a few people who are saying they're having a bit of trouble hearing you, okay?
Okay, I'll try that.
Okay.
All All right, comprehensive planning versus policy planning as a functional area. This will also be covered probably every week with these, the differences between the two in some way, shape, or form. Comprehensive planning, just think the word comprehensive, that's really what it is. It has a full geographic scope, generally an entire jurisdiction or an entire sub-area of the jurisdiction. Comprehensive planning tends to have a longer time frame, 10 to 20 years, and it tends to be arranged in a topical type of scope. There is some getting away from that in more recent times, but I think with the way the exam approaches it, if you think of it as a topical scope, you'll be all right. Policy planning, conversely, focuses more on specifics, development, review, a specific proposal, a specific problem that the community is facing. It has shorter time frames. I say up to 10 years. Sometimes you'll go through policy planning for something that just needs to get over a hurdle that's only going to be 18 months in scope. That's a policy plan. And it also tends to focus very specifically on one point. It might be a sewer issue. It might be a housing issue. But what's the policy and how is it going to address the issue that's at hand before the community? In terms of land use, most people, when they think of planning, think of this area. Land use includes the zoning ordinances and the different codes that we use. You know the different kinds of zoning, and we have them listed up here: Euclidean, cumulative, non-cumulative, form-based, performance, spot zoning. Understand the benefits and the detriments each one poses. When it is appropriate, the situation when it's appropriate to use each kind of zoning. Some communities aren't ready for form-based or performance zoning. Some communities can simply get by or prefer their Euclidean zoning. Others prefer cumulative zoning, where you're allowed to stack the uses. Everything in the lower zone is allowed in a higher zone, that kind of idea. So understand how the zoning ordinances work. Also, the process, the basic process of your zoning ordinance. What's the role of the zoning board? What's the role of a zoning enforcement person? And don't let terminology confuse you. Different states have different ways of approaching the titles of the board. Some call them Board of Appeals, some call them Boards of Adjustment, some call them hearing boards. Whatever title you're used to, just be aware there's other titles out. Generally, by the context of the question, you can tell what they're talking about in terms of what board. But don't let yourself get bogged down in your particular state's nomenclature. Think of the general process overall. And that goes for the next point on the list as well, the subdivision and land development ordinances. That term in and of itself may be a Pennsylvania-ism, but the subdivision and land development, understand and know good design. You're likely to get some form of question that's going to expect you to point out errors or problems with a subdivision or a site design. It might be in lot layout. It might be in how the circulation is done on the plan. You may have roads or that don't connect, or lots that don't have frontage. Understand the application of subdivision and what the purpose of subdivision is, to keep the development of land orderly, and the access and the impacts of the development can be mitigated through a subdivision and land development ordinance. In terms of the land development side, again, know the basic process of the preliminary plan to a final plan to recording the plan to building it. Know that basic process. Again, understand basic site layout, what a good, healthy parking lot circulation is, access for ingress and egress, both to the site and to the building, pedestrian circulation, buffering, and screening. Those are the basic points for the development ordinances. In terms, excuse me. In terms of exactions, again, we have them all listed out here. Parks, schools, open space would be types of dedication of land where the developer is actually expected to set aside a piece of land within his development for the general overall good of the community. That can take place either with an actual dedication. Sometimes they go as far as to require the construction of the park, or they'll require installation of infrastructure. Maybe the nearest sewer line's a quarter mile away. The developer will need to extend that to serve his development. Other ways are to have a cash payment in place of actually putting it in. Those sometimes are called impact fees. Impact fees are basically compensation for a measured impact that the development will have. And while we're on exactions, keep in mind the 1994 Supreme Court case, the Dolan case, which required rough proportionality, which basically said the municipality couldn't go hog wild with what they were requiring of a developer. There needed to be a link between what was being required and what the impact of the development was on the community. Other types of development under land use. We're all used to the standard subdivision and the standard commercial type developments, but be familiar with some of these transit-oriented designs. Think of some of the areas in the bigger cities where they've started focusing on transit stations. Mixed-use developments, upper floor residential with lower floor commercial, the old standard downtown type concepts. Brownfield redevelopment. Brownfields are fields that used to be used that have fallen into disuse that are available for redevelopment in some way, shape, or form. Greenfield development are newer areas that have never been developed, maybe except for agriculture or lumbering. And infill development is where you have maybe a vacant lot in the middle of an otherwise built-up area. I tend to think of infill as residential, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And you can see some of the other types that are there. And then at the bottom of some of these slides, I should point out we have some policy guides that are listed that will help you with each of these topics if you have questions on them. In terms of growth management, understand the different methodologies and techniques. Growth boundaries, that's the picture at the right of the screen. Lancaster County in Pennsylvania is fairly well known for its growth boundary program. They're based on studies of build-out and growth projected over a certain period of time. Other ways of growth management limit the extension of infrastructure, install some performance criteria in your ordinance. Think of the Ramapo case back in the 1970s where they had different points given for different aspects of the development, and you need to achieve a certain point level to be able to build. Density bonuses would be another technique for growth management where you're encouraging a developer to focus on one area instead of spreading out across the landscape. And impact fees can also be used here as well. Annexation is a growth management tool. If you're in the Northeast, it may be a little unfamiliar to you. Pennsylvania, and then to the east and north, we tend not to have annexation so much. That may be unfamiliar to you. I'll read up on it. The difference between hostile and friendly annexation. Hostile is where the municipality goes out and takes the land and annexes it in over the objections of the property owner, whereas friendly annexation is a developer coming in and wanting to be attached to the city so he can enjoy the services. ETJ is extraterritorial jurisdiction. Again, that's a planning tool, not available in every state, but it enables the city to reach beyond its boundaries with the expectation that eventually it's going to be annexed, and they have the ability to reach beyond the boundary there to have some limited control over what's taking place. So when it does become annexed, the land use and development patterns are in place and blend seamlessly with the city that's annexed them. Community identity relates to how a community identifies with itself, as well as how others identify that community. And oftentimes community identity has a core focus, a downtown, or it might be quote-unquote a college town or a prison town. Whatever that core focus is helps with the community identity. That plays into growth management. If there's no focus, oftentimes the community gets absorbed or people move away and the community becomes obsolete. And again, some policy guides to help through at the bottom there. Community development, another one of the larger areas. Some people may be more familiar with this, but there's different aspects of community development that are available to the community. You can develop through economics, you can develop through the social fabric, you can develop through the physical design of community infrastructure. Economically, what is the role in the region? In other words, what do we do as a community? We need to identify ourselves. Oftentimes, smaller communities have one big industry. It might be a paper mill. It might be a feed mill, things like that. What do we do? What can we offer to others around us? And as we develop as a community, what can we afford? Those are economic aspects of community development that we need to keep in mind. Socially, what are the attitudes of our community? Do we have a positive attitude about ourselves, or do we have an attitude that, well, we're in the rust belt and we're just fading away to nothing, and as we get older and grayer, we're not going to be around anymore? Or does our community have a vibrant attitude that, this is who we are and this is what we want to be, and people want to come down here and we want to be here, and this is just what we want? We need to understand the attitudes. If it's a negative attitude, we need to find ways as part of the community development to start turning that around. And oftentimes that's done through structures in the community, the schools, the newspapers, civic groups are instrumental in turning those around. Also the community hierarchy, who are the prominent families, who are the prominent developers, the politicians, locally and sometimes even at the state level. They all have an impact on the social fabric for community development. Infrastructure components that affect community development include the age of your infrastructure. Obviously, if you have 100-year-old sewer pipes, they're wearing out and need to be replaced. Capacity of the system. You may have a transportation system that looks like the one at the bottom of the picture there. That's a perceived capacity need. But many people in a downtown, that's probably something you want to see, is cars like that, because it means there's people that want to come into that area. What's the need that your infrastructure needs to address? Do you have holes in your infrastructure? And who has control of the infrastructure? Is it local control? Is it an authority control? Is it a private control? Some water companies are privately owned. Or in some cases, there may be state or even federal control of infrastructure. Also with community development, we have different models. Main Street's listed here. In Pennsylvania, we also have an Elm Street model. These models basically focus on core areas. The core area comes together for management, marketing, and maintenance. If you think of Main Street as an M, and then those three M words, management, marketing, and maintenance. And then Elm Street tends to be a model that focuses basically on the same idea, but it extends the areas around the core business area. Housing and urban development tools that can be used. The basics of CDBG, understand what the CDBG program is about, and understand the limits. Some give-me questions on the exam that sometimes come up relate to the, what's the minimum amount of CDBG allocation that needs to be given to low mod. That's 70%. Slums and blight can be up to 30%. Public services, 15%. Just understand some of those. Once in a while, they'll give you a give-me question on those. And have a basic understanding of some of the other HUD programs that relate to community development. And we'll look at some a little later here. But the home program, which enables people to rehab their housing, whether it's rental or owner-occupied. ESG is emergency shelter grants. That's, again, to pretty much as it says, to provide funding to provide people with shelters. HOPE is assistance for housing assistance for people with AIDS. And then the HOPE program is a more generalized urban development tool through HUD. Grassroots successes. There is a Seattle experience that's out there that's a good experience to look up. They have a department where they give out grants to neighborhoods. I believe it used to be called actually Department of Neighborhoods. It focuses on grassroots efforts, and they gave out mini grants, like up to $1,500 or so, for small projects in the community within each neighborhood that was interested. Much of it went to community gardening or just community gardens. The one that's a little more well-known out of that program is an area in town where they put a troll under the bridge. But all these projects, and what was there was the grassroots, the people in the community in each specific neighborhood coming together, identifying what they wanted to do, and making it happen. And oftentimes with planning, as we all know, there's a tendency to hijack it from the top down, and planning is really the most successful when it comes from the bottom up, and community development is no different that way. With urban design, we have the standard traditions of urban design, which most people that have had planning theory classes will recognize this list. The monumental city design, the easy one to think there is Washington, D.C. You got the design of the city around different monuments, streets and boulevards that are designed in a way to enhance that experience. The garden suburb and garden cities, sort of the same ideas with curvilinear streets, flexible grids, maybe some cul-de-sacs and greenways, definitely getting some green space within the developed area. In terms of a garden suburb, think of Riverside or Garden City, Radburn, New Jersey. Modernism is the more modern buildings, the glass-plated faces, the interesting, or I shouldn't say, well, some people they think they're interesting, but the flatter architecture that gives you that nice sleek look. Pictures of cities in China that are on the APA website gives you an idea of modernism. Some of our revitalized downtowns in the Rust Belt have some of this example too. I can think of downtown Pittsburgh. The megastructure idea comes from the connecting areas together, either through pedestrian ways, above ground or underground. The Twin Cities has this. Des Moines, Iowa has this. Toronto, Canada has the same idea. It's where you have one whole area where you're inside and you work and play and recreate and live all within the same building, and it's all connected together. Okay, the social aspects of urban design. Urban design can either bring people together or it can encourage separation. And I think one of the lessons planning has learned in the last half century is that the cookie-cutter type subdivisions that were very popular back in the 50s and 60s had their role in doing the latter, encouraging separation of people. Urban design can be done in such a way that it brings people together. If you look at the picture on the right, you have commercial on the bottom, residential up top, good, healthy, wide spaces for pedestrian interaction. But you also have the vehicle access that allows people from the outside to come in. It's a mutual symbiosis of both commercial and residential, maybe even some industrial entertainment type ideas coming in there to bring people out, to draw them out, and have them, encourage them to come together as a community and have that community identity that's so important for a vital community. Things that help that in terms of social aspects tie back into design aspects, density, land use, the function of a building, the modeling and the management of the placement of uses within a community. And it all has this psychological impact on people. If it's an interesting place, people will want to be out there and experience. If it's kept up and maintained, people want to be out there and participate and be a part of it. If it's left to deteriorate, people tend to draw the curtains and pull up the carpet, so to speak. Again, there's an important part of the social aspect, too, that you need to draw in your elements of the community that aren't related to the government. Many are the communities that have hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars into a commercial area in terms of streetscapes, improving sidewalks and crosswalks and parking areas, and putting landscaping in and benches and making it attractive. But it flops because they fail to get the social side done. With urban design, there's also the neo-traditional movement, new urbanism. An example here is Seaside, Florida. This is characterized by mixed-use development, a grid street pattern, higher densities. They tend to have front porches if you have sole residential uses especially. In the commercial areas, there's rear parking instead of the front parking. It does tend to favor the pedestrian and the transit flows, and it may somewhat discourage autos, not necessarily though. Again, the ground floor commercial, upper floor residential, and minimal setbacks, again, to encourage that density. And it focuses on the social and the gathering places of the community. And then this was identified all the way back in 1929. We had this regional plan for New York City, and the concept, Clarence Perry, that might be a give me, and the title might be a give me question on the exam actually. But the concepts that come behind this are we call it new, but they were formed almost 100 years ago, or somewhat forgotten, or became somewhat obscure, and have been pulled forward again here in the last 15 or 20 years. We have a sample question. I'll let Susan do the poll here. Which of the following are characteristics of new urbanism? And I just went over some of this. Higher density and mixing of uses, variety of housing choices and grid street patterns, economies of scale and Euclidean zoning, pedestrian scale and multimodal transportation systems. Now, this question, more importantly than listening to the content right now, look at the type of question it is. It's a two-tiered question. You need to think of what new urbanism is. So you have 1, 2, 3, and 4 in terms of Roman numerals, but those aren't the answers you're giving. You're giving an answer for A, B, C, and D down underneath there. So this is a format of question you'll see on the exam probably a number of times. In my experience, they've enjoyed this type of question because it enables you to pull in different elements of different concepts. So we have here higher density, the mixing of uses, variety of housing choices and grid street patterns, economies of scale, Euclidean zoning, pedestrian scale, and multimodal transportation systems.
Okay.
So as we go through here, and the first thing I think of in new urbanism is actually the first one, so higher density and mixing of uses. Well, that doesn't narrow it down for me.
Dave, I just want to break in and say I did go ahead and launch the poll, and I just want to apologize to everyone. The polls are limited in what we can actually type in, the amount of space that they provide us. So the way the poll comes up, it says, what are the characteristics of new urbanism? And then somewhat in the question, and then somewhat as the last answer, which is not an answer, I had to list the 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 1 is the higher density, 2, housing choice, 3, economies of scale, 4, pedestrian scale. And then the answers that I want people to be choosing from are A, B, C, and D. But it looks a little different on the quick poll, so I just wanted to let everybody know that. And I'll give a minute or so for
I want to do that too.
For people to answer. And Dave, we're getting just still a few complaints from people about audio. It seems like every so often things get a little quieter and then they get a little louder. So if you could try and speak up for those people.
Or if I have a loose wire too. I've noticed I echo in my own phone here. That's indicative of a bad wire.
Okay. And also for the attendees out there, you can check your audio connection through the GoToWebinar menu box on the right-hand side and just check that. But we found from previous webcasts that sometimes if you're sitting at your desk or in a conference room or something and you're trying to listen through the computer without a headset or through a phone and the volume, sometimes it is a limiting audio on the end of the receiver because we aren't getting that many complaints about audio. I think we have most of the responses that we're going to get for the poll. So I'm going to go ahead and close that and then share the results up on the screen. It looks like 49% voted for B, and then it was split somewhat between A, C, and D. So I will go ahead and hide that and get you back to your screen, Dave, where you can bring the answer up.
All right. Okay. One of this type of question, you narrow it down. Like I said, when I think of new urbanism, I think of that first one, and the first one doesn't help me narrow it down at all. So then I need to move on and look at some of the other choices that are here. And well, as you go through, you sit there and think of two. You know, yeah, we have a variety of housing choices and street patterns. I'm not sure about number 3 here, economies of scale and Euclidean zoning. Well, as soon as I see Euclidean zoning, that's going to raise a red flag on me. And then pedestrian scale and multimodal, again, that picture we had on the last screen was at that level. So if I was on the exam and didn't know the answer, I would pick B, because number 3 to me is the weakest of those 4 choices. And as you see, B is the correct answer in this case. The Euclidean zoning does actually kick it out. So that's an example of a 2-tiered question. That format does come up on the exam, and it makes you think through some things. And sometimes they'll throw a little curve in on you, where they'll do something where they'll slip a, instead of the California Coastal Commission, they might have the Carolina Coastal Commission or something like that. So you make sure you read the question. Okay, moving on. Looking at housing. Housing is another larger area. There may be some out there that deal exclusively in housing. It's an area like land use or transportation, community development. It's one of the larger areas. The New York City examples that you read about in some of the various planning literature are a good base for our current housing situation in the United States. And I'm not talking about the recession. I'm talking about development patterns and codes. New York City, all the way back in 1867, adopted a tenement house law, which became the first major housing code in the United States. It formed the basis for a major update and rewrite that they did in 1901. Lawrence Vidier, he was a housing advocate back in the turn of the last century there, and he advocated for housing reform. If you think of how things were back in the Industrial Revolution, at the height of the Industrial Revolution, and you had all that immigration, people were on top of people, and the housing situation was bad. He updated the code to require light and open space to come in, and he had some structural elements that were also required. That code served as the basis for national building codes. People started seeing those ideas, and they took them and moved them on. And I am told that code lasted 100 years before it underwent another major overhaul. Not that it wasn't tweaked over time. New York City certainly kept on top of things that way. But they thought it through well enough that it served them well for 100 years, obviously keeping up with the technology and housing. Federal involvements, we have the different HUD programs that I already have gone over. Urban renewal back after the Second World War in the latter part of the middle of the last century. Urban renewal, sometimes facetiously called urban removal. The goal of it was to remove the slum and the blight areas of urban areas so that they could be revitalized to look like something in the picture there. Obviously, from experience, we look back on that. Some of them were successful, but a number of the complaints were that the people that were targeted for those programs were poor and disenfranchised and oftentimes minority. And the program, whether rightly or not, was perceived as being an abuse, and it was slowly faded into the background as a program there. But the concepts of going in and removing blight, whether it be singly or through a neighborhood, remain in place today. And you can look around not too hard in most cities and see some form of urban renewal going on. There's some housing acts back in the 1930s that encouraged home ownership and did some financial reform to encourage home ownership. That financial reform formed the base, again, of the entire way we finance housing today with our mortgages and our down payments. So those two acts, as you come across them, read up on what they did and how they work. If you understand how home ownership works, today, even with the 20% down, a amortized long-term mortgage, about 30 years, with a consistent payment across the life of the loan. That wasn't all quote-unquote given back then. That was all a new concept that was put in place under Roosevelt in the 1930s through those two housing acts. The latter of those two acts began the public housing framework, again, that we see today. Again, that's a program that's had its ups and downs, it has its faults, and it has its benefits. But the basic framework and the basic concepts behind public housing started with those acts back in the 1930s. State roles in housing tend to be through financing, consumer advocacy, and some states have statewide building codes and that they pass down and expect the localities to enforce. That's about all you would really need to delve into there that I'm aware of, that the states take care of financing, advocacy, and codes, whereas the local government role, they tend to administer things. They have to administer and enforce the codes. They create the local housing authorities that actually provide the housing, and they also provide the infrastructure that supports that housing as well. While we're on housing, there is a rural slum phenomenon that's been going on for a number of years. This relates to the brain drain concept. The rural areas especially, people out there, young people growing up, get their eyes on different areas. They don't want to stick around the home place. They want to go into the city and make something of themselves, and it's perceived that they can't do that on the home place. And as a result, people are moving out, and as the parents get too old to maintain the rural area, the rural lot, whatever it might be a farm, it might not be a farm, but as the parents get too old to maintain all that and they move into more appropriate housing for their stage in life, the house that people grew up in is left to deteriorate, and it causes a slum. Again, the brain drain idea, the desire for city living for those that are those that are younger, and there's a perceived or real, depending on which region you're in, but a perceived or real lack of jobs in the area that's not holding people in place, and therefore, because there's no jobs, people aren't staying in the housing. Different types of housing. There's senior housing, whole subdivisions and courts that are put in place just for seniors, senior exclusive, and that ranges from totally independent living all the way up to almost hospice care within a nursing home. And you have independent living, assisted living, somewhat independent care living, life needs living, and then the full nursing home. Multi-family housing, where you have, like a picture here. Actually, I would consider this to be more attached single-family housing from what the picture looks like. But some people would consider that, because it's one large building, to be multi-family. Mixed-use housing, again, the housing that's interspersed in the downtowns. What are the issues and the opportunities that are provided by each of these types of housing? Senior housing provides a good place for people to congregate with people of like age and interests, but it excludes the younger set. And there is something in a community that the community benefits from having people across age. However, there's also something from that perspective of the senior that is attractive to not having the younger set there, not having children in place, and all like that. issues and opportunities. Affordable housing has a negative perception oftentimes, but it can be done right, and that perception can be overcome, if especially if it's interspersed in what we might call a quote-unquote regular neighborhood. I don't really like to use that term, but if you have a neighborhood that's out there and you say 10% has to be affordable, and you scatter that 10% throughout that whole neighborhood, that provides an opportunity for the people in those houses to blend in and not be relegated to a certain section of town. But consider the issues and the opportunities of each type of housing. There's even benefits to the standard cookie-cutter style subdivision that we seem to be wanting to get away from. Okay, energy policy. This is excuse me. This is a somewhat newer area in terms of the exam. Energy policies, understand how they work at the national and state and local levels and how they tie together. They're not going to ask you specific questions, at least I wouldn't expect them to, on necessarily a national energy policy, especially things that have come out in the last year or two. The exam doesn't change that fast. But understand the difference between energy conservation, and conservation of energy. Energy and conservation of energy are scientific terms, whereas energy conservation is what we think of as turning out the lights when you're not in the room, combining trips in your automobile, that kind of idea. Understand what the concept of peak theory is. That there's a certain point where the demand simply can't, or the supply simply can't keep up with the demand, and that relates into some petroleum dependency issues. In terms of fossil fuels, there are different types of fossil fuels. The most common that we think of are coal, gas, and oil. Since we were just mentioning petroleum dependence and what it can mean for our society, oil affects us in two ways, possibly three ways. Oil, for many people, is used to heat. So it's an energy source that way, but it's also, more of us think of it as a mobility issue. Oil forms the base fuel for many of our vehicles. But oil, many people don't think of oil as being a key component of many of our products. We all are looking at a computer right now. I'm on a phone. It's all made out of plastic, and plastic is dependent on oil for the most part. So based on traditional methods and traditional locations, as of 2005, they expected peak oil to occur between 2007 and 2015. That has changed somewhat. New locations and new methods have been found and developed. So I'm sure if I were to look that up again, we'll see that date being pushed back. In terms of coal, there's two types. There's hard coal and there's soft coal. The advantages to coal is it tends to be cheap, and the energy is produced right there locally. You pull the coal out of the ground, and the plant's right down the road. Disadvantages is the historic dirt that comes out of the coal plants. They have cleaned up in more recent years, but they still have that dirty perception. And there's also the environmental damage of mining the coal out of the ground. One big advantage to coal is, if we, again, think of energy in terms of the peak theory, peak coal will not occur based on current supply, and that's without developing anything new. But based on current supply, peak coal won't happen until the 23rd century. And coal is used primarily for heating and power. Natural gas is used for heating and cooking. We're starting to see more vehicles come out this way. Right up the road here in State College, the bus system is all powered by natural gas. The disadvantage to gas is it's difficult to handle. It's difficult to extract, process, and transport across the landscape. So that's a disadvantage. However, there are other advantages. It does tend to burn cleaner than the other types. And up until a couple years ago, it was also cheaper. peak gas occurred in North America around 2002 or 3, but that was prior to recent discoveries and developments in the industry, and that has negated the peak gas concept, at least for the time being. Looking at renewable energy, there's 4 different types that tend to come up. Wind is the fastest growing sector. It is the disadvantage is it's not constant, and there was an estimate that the average turbine is only in production 25% of the time. The advantage is all you have to do is put a turbine up, and the wind takes care of the rest. Another disadvantage, though, is the aesthetic impact and the wildlife impacts that are being associated with these big turbines. Not too many people want the turbine near their property. Many people in this area, we have them on the ridges, and people feel that the natural and wild landscape of the Allegheny Ridges here has been marred by the several dozen, maybe several score of turbines that have been put up that are visible from the city down here in the valley. Wildlife impacts as well. Each pad for those requires about a 1-acre site to be cleared. And you also have birds and bats that don't understand that the blades are coming around, and the blade tends to take care of the birds and kill them. Solar energy, the popularity for solar is increasing, especially as the costs are now decreasing. There's active and passive solar. Active solar uses mechanical means to ensure that the panel is always collecting the most it can from the sun. Passive solar are panels that stay in place. There are also aesthetic concerns with the solar panels, although with some of the newer technologies, those are being overcome. However, you can think of some solar farms where they take acres and acres of land just to collect the rays of the sun. Some think of it as land grabbing for a very low use. So that's a disadvantage. Of course, the advantage is on solar that as long as there's a sun, there will be a source of power for them. Hydro energy is water-based. Water tended to be used for irrigation and mechanics back in 100 years ago and earlier. They use those 2 concepts, and we now use water for power generation. These large dams where they force the water down through the pipes, through the turbines, and out the bottom, they require vast areas of land to be taken, especially if it's a commercial generation or a municipal generation. And with a corresponding environmental impact, obviously you're going to be inundating quite a number of usually square miles of a land to back up the water to get enough pressure to produce the energy that needs to be produced. That's the disadvantage. An advantage, of course, is as long as you have the water, you have the power. And then another renewable that's coming onto the scene is geothermal. It uses the conductive heat of the earth, the conductive heat patterns of the earth as the heat rises and sinks to either heat or cool housing. It can also be used as a power source now. Right now, it has a very high cost for what it can produce, and there is an unknown subsurface impact. However, there is no visible impact outside of the property where it's located. And a lot of this can be reviewed both in our chapter notes and also in the 2 policy guides that are down there. It is a relatively new area for the exam, but that touches on it in a nutshell. I think we're ready for questions.
Yes, and a couple different things here. I'm going to address 2 issues, I guess, and then have a couple questions to send back to you, Dave. But people were asking about the test date and the policy guides, because one of the policy guides has been updated in 2011 on energy. And I have not asked APA specifically about that issue. but I did ask them a similar question a year or so ago regarding the ethics code, which was also updated past 2008, the date of the last exam update. And APA's answer to me on that was essentially if there was a question in the exam pool, and there's many questions in the pool that they can use for anyone's individual exam, but if there's any sort of an issue with a question, essentially they throw that question out. So if you have the old energy policy guide and you have the new energy policy guide, and I'm sure there's some different numbers and percentages probably in there about, you know, energy use or things of that nature. And essentially I wouldn't get too hung up on anything, you know, if the 2011 guide says, you know, energy use from 1990 to 2010 was this and this, well then you're not going to have to know that for the exam. And in a similar fashion, you know, they probably just have thrown out any questions that have that sort of an issue with them. So I wouldn't get too concerned about things like that, but I would know information, you know, kind of general energy use 1990 versus 2000, but there's probably not going to be much on the policy guide level past that point anyway. So that's that issue. Regarding the audio, we still have a few people who are having problems with audio. It is limited, so it's not an overall issue for our 300 attendees that we have right now. I would just remind you that you can check your audio connection in the go-to menu box on the right. And people are sending in to me essentially that they're on a headset and a headset seems to be working fine. And someone did also share that they're using their iPod as their speaker essentially, and that's working very well for them. So that's an idea for people as well. So back to actual content now. Dave, somebody wanted you to essentially repeat the energy policy terminology, and I believe they were referring more to your earlier information, like the federal state type of information, not when you went down into the specific solar versus hydro versus geothermal or anything like that. Is there anything you want to go back over in terms of energy policy terminology?
Yeah, the terminologies I was mentioning at the beginning, then the definitions are in our chapter notes here, but the definition of energy, the definition of conservation of energy, and then the idea of energy conservation come up. And then also in our notes you'll see the idea of peak theory. I think we actually listed it as Hubbard's peak theory. If you can understand those four concepts, I think that's really all you need to understand in terms of those terms.
Okay. And
there's
someone
also
just
under the peak theory, there's also the energy return on energy investment, but feedback I've gotten is that's not turned up on the exam. So
okay. Kind of lost my place there for a moment. Housing reform in New York. Can you mention the person again? Lawrence Wheeler, is it?
I think it's Wheeler. Yeah, I can never pronounce it. It's Wheeler, V-E-I-L-L-E-R.
All right, that's one of the main people to know for housing reform
Yeah.
in New York.
Catherine Bauer. I didn't mention her, but she comes up often too, I guess. At least she has in our training sessions. I didn't mention her this time through.
Okay, and someone is asking about the CDBG, which is Community Development Block Grant, the percentages, the breakdown for percentages on that?
Oh, yes, the breakdowns. Basically, understand the three criteria for CDBG, which is to assist low mod income people, and to reduce or eliminate slum and blight and urgent need. Those are the three areas. And then within those areas, regulatorily, CDBG requires at least 70% to be used for lower moderate income persons, up to 30% for prevention or elimination of slum and blight. Now you'll notice that comes to 100%. Within those two, you're allowed to use 20% for administering the grant, and you're allowed to use 15% for what they call public services, which are like social services. There's a community around here that uses it to put police on their feet on bikes for community outreach, and it helps with the crime prevention, things like that. But that's public service, or something maybe where they're doing outreach to children that might be identified as trouble. That would be a public service. But it's the basics are 70 up to, or at least 70%. I'm sorry, yeah, at least 70% for low, moderate income people, up to 30% for slum and blight, and then 20% for administering the grant, and 15% for public service.
Okay. Someone is asking for a good resource for plan review, essentially. And one thing I would point to for that, I believe that the Practice of Local Government book has some information on that, which some people refer to as the Green Bible, and it is. It was noted in last week's presentation. And then, of course, you can always go to the APA reading list. It does break things down into specific categories as well. Did you have anything, Dave, you wanted to add to that?
I do, but not at my fingertips.
Okay.
Our last slide, I believe, has our email on it. If that person and anybody else interested could send that to me, and I will get that reference to them.
Okay.
Yeah, I have it, but it's probably not at my fingertips quick enough to
Okay.
To get that out.
Okay. Somebody had a question regarding the Main Street programs. She missed the third M: management, marketing, and
Maintenance.
Maintenance. Okay. So that's the 3 M's for Main Street programs: management, marketing, and maintenance. Another person has a question on issues regarding affordable versus senior versus multifamily housing. I'll take a first crack at that. One thing, if a community is just looking at community facilities, sometimes you have different things to think about. We have some communities in my area now that are actually, they're pushing to have more senior housing in their area. And one of the reasons they push for that is because it reduces student enrollment numbers in the school district. On the other side of that, however, they're finding that they have more of a need now for increased police, fire, and ambulance responses to 911 calls, and just a different set of recreation requests, essentially, from a senior community versus a younger community. So it's that type of thing that you just have to be aware of what people are in need of, essentially. Dave, did you want to talk any more about any issues regarding affordable housing or multifamily housing?
The other issues to understand, multifamily housing tends to have a lower transportation impact, especially as you compare it to single-family detached dwellings. There is a grid, I believe it's again in our chapter notes, that shows how that decreases over time, but there are different transportation and environmental impacts. The multifamily, basically the more density you can put in, the lower the impact overall on the community. Obviously, as you increase density locally, you're going to have a big impact right at the site and maybe immediately surrounding it. And those are things you need to balance, and that's why we sit in the chairs we sit in. But both transportation and environmentally, it seems as you increase, like for multifamily especially, and maybe mixed use, the overall impact does tend to decrease, but in terms of the transportation environment. But as you said, emergency services sometimes get stressed as you increase that density. They don't have as much room to maneuver.
Okay, let me check and see if we've got any other questions in here. Someone's asking for the CDBG information in text, essentially, which I can understand. Again, I would email Dave directly for that, and I'll also try and get it added to our slides as well. That would probably be the easiest way to do that. Okay, that's all of our questions for now. Dave, if you could pass back to me, basically. And I will remind everyone else at this point in time, every so often Dave refers to our notes, and when he's doing that, he is essentially talking about the Pennsylvania chapter's Professional Development Committee study notes, which are on our website, same place as everything else is located. If you go under the career heading and then go to the AICP exam page, those study notes are located down in there. So if Dave ever says like, oh yes, they're in there, that's the in there part, basically. Everyone should be able to see the food system planning slide now. Let me just make sure. Yeah, that looks good. Is that what you see, Dave? Are you still there?
Yeah, that's what I have.
Okay, all right.
Looks fine.
Then we're good. Okay, food system planning. One of the things to just think about, and APA had thought about this by 2008 when the exam was last updated. When people used to think about food, it used to automatically go to agriculture and land, and we need to preserve the land. And that is sort of where that line automatically went. And that has certainly been changing over the past 10 to 15 years, thinking more about the food system, identifying a food shed for a city, and then the implications, not just on land use, but on public health, energy, pollution, economic development, and labor force. And the food planning policy guide for APA goes into that type of thing much more. They also have an agricultural lands preservation policy guide, which is certainly good to know, but I think the food planning guide is probably a more unfamiliar topic to people in general. In reference to public health, they're talking about, people need access to fresh food, people need access to fruit and vegetables. It's just healthier for people in general. You can go into probably the food planning policy guide, as well as some more specific things. Regionally, the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission did a huge study on food. I believe it came out in 2010, and they looked at people's access to fresh food and what that meant in relation to their income levels and things of that nature. And generally, people who are lower on the income level don't have access to food that is as healthy for them. Energy use, this kind of goes into the idea of a food shed. City of Philadelphia at some point in time with DVRPC looked into where its food was coming from and how far it was being trucked and things of that nature. And it has a huge energy implication. I mean, if your food is being shipped in from great distances, is that really an energy efficient policy? And sometimes that is addressed in a food study. Sometimes also if a municipality has done a lot of work on their energy planning and policy, you can see it addressed in there as well. Pollution, of course, that's a little bit more of a known area with food and agriculture. Much more of a push for organic. What are the implications on health for chemical use? What does that mean to the environment? Use of water. In certain areas of the country, water issues are huge in agriculture. They have an enormous draw on aquifers or surface water sources. Economic development, keeping your farms in place and then also allowing them to diversify and to start doing secondary businesses and to transition into a community supported agriculture operation, things of that nature. And then the labor force, the standard picture of who a farmer is changing quite a bit. Farms are transitioning down. You can hear different information on who is entering the agricultural labor force. That's one area. Also, migrant labor, which then turns into issues of immigration policy and things of that nature. So the labor force that keeps the entire agricultural food system running has a lot of issues going on in it. Hazard mitigation and disaster planning. The United States keeps getting reminder after reminder about why this is a good thing to be paying attention to. The Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 put some things in place, and events that have happened since then have shown that we don't necessarily have everything down. Hazard mitigation plans are typically something that is done at the county level, and that's thinking ahead of, okay, in our municipality, what we're faced with are floods and winter snowstorms that can be debilitating, and power outages that result from both of those issues. You know, that's what happens. We have the best likelihood of that. Here's how we're going to deal with it. Then you have emergency operations plans. Those are done more on a municipal level. And that is, and these are very important now, in those plans, they're not necessarily talking about how the exact response to the natural disaster goes or man-made disaster goes, but they're talking about who is responding in what fashion and who are they talking to, and what's the chain of command. And that is that deals more in this language of disaster planning and response. The National Incident Management System, the NIM system, that's what people are supposed to be working within. So they're all speaking the same language, essentially. And as I said, Katrina and other disasters have just pointed out continuously the problems when you have multiple different agencies, different levels of government, and there's got to be a common language among those entities, and they need to have a plan in place to start with, but then everybody needs to be coordinating effectively. Historic preservation, absolutely big ticket item. You need to be familiar with the National Historic Preservation Act, which was in 1966. This set up the National Register of Historic Places. It set up the Section 106 process, and it set up that each state has to have a state historic preservation office, or SHPO as it is sometimes called. You know, when people talk about, oh, that house is on the National Register, you know, that comes from the Act, the 1966 Act. When PennDOT has to go through the Section 106 process and, you know, consider how its projects can potentially be impacting historic structures, that Section 106 process is laid out in, again, the National Historic Preservation Act. And of course the state historic preservation offices, which every state is going to have the SHPO, and then in each different state it's going to have a different you know, state name as well. In Pennsylvania, it's the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, PHMC. In a different state that could be titled entirely different, but they're both the SHPO for the state, and in that role funding comes through them, and they are in charge of you know, helping get things on the National Register. They're in charge of funneling down funds through a certified local government program, things of that nature. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 was very important in that it set up tax benefits for rehabbing historic structures. So just be familiar with that. Local preservation efforts, they are really important, but I don't think you have to, I don't know that there's like too much in current times to be aware of a specific place. More going back to historic preservation efforts did start at the local level. For example, New Orleans in 1921 had the first commission. Charleston in 1931 had the first historic preservation ordinance. Those are important to know. There is a policy guide for this. And then case law. When you're going through and studying the different sections of for the exam, always be thinking back to how the different angles of something. So here's historic preservation. It's a functional topic, but think back to what case law is relevant to it. The Penn Central versus New York from 1978 is an important historic preservation case law. and that essentially dealt with takings as well. Sometimes you hear it discussed in terms of its importance in taking. Sometimes you'll hear it discussed as its importance in essentially validating historic preservation regulation. Park recreation and open space. You definitely need to know the different types of parks and the distinctions between them. And I'm not going to go through all of them. Some of them are rather straightforward. Greenways for essentially linear corridors of green space. Frequently it follows a stream corridor. It doesn't have to, however. But look in our study notes or in another source and find out, more the size, number, service area, those types of things between a community park versus a neighborhood park versus a pocket park. One big distinction among them is the service area that they expect to be drawing people from. Cost and benefits, just important to keep in mind that the benefits are sometimes not as spelled out, although agencies are getting better at doing that to prove their worth. The costs are very well known in terms of, acquiring the land and building the equipment, getting it in place, and then maintaining these facilities. Active versus passive recreation, just in terms of active recreation is more what when people are talking about a community park, a neighborhood park, they're really talking about an active park. And a lot of the information on active parks and where they should be and who they should be serving is more spelled out than passive recreation areas, which kind of slide more into the open space category. And those often get you into the public versus private open space. A lot of municipalities or regions have preserved open space, and it officially is counting as open space somewhere, but it's not public. It's not for public use. It serves a different purpose. It's serving that open space purpose. It is never intended to serve a recreation purpose. And then again, the demographics. A community's demographics can call for specific things. As I said, older senior communities sometimes prefer more passive parks with some walking trails. You get a much younger demographic, and there's more of a need for active recreation. And then going back to, again, looking into different areas of the test content. Case law, Overton Park versus Volpe in 1971, essentially validated Section 4F, and that basically said the federal government had to follow its own regulations and preserve park areas that had been set aside. But definitely be familiar with that. And then, of course, the legislation is Section 4F of the Department of Transportation Act. It was a fairly early piece of legislation that transportation departments ignored for a fair amount of time, and then the citizens around Overton Park made that not the case anymore. Natural resources and environment. I do not have all the legislation listed here. I definitely have the bigger ticket items, but there was a lot that went into place from about the mid-1960s up through 1980, really. NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, is what all the federal agencies need to follow when they're going to be out doing projects, essentially. Avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to environmental resources, and NEPA is the process that they need to go through for that. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, still very essential pieces of legislation that EPA is carrying out enforcement of those. The Endangered Species Act. What you see there, RCRA and CERCLA. RCRA is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, I believe, which essentially was the federal government laying out how hazardous materials should be handled while they're still in process. From the time they're generated until they're done being used in industry or wherever their use is. This is the process in which they need to be handled. CERCLA is better known as the Superfund legislation, and that is, of course, for the past 100 years, all of these hazardous materials were not handled and disposed of properly, so we've created Superfund sites that we need to go out now and clean up. So EPA was established, and a lot of this, it's very interesting. I don't know, I find it interesting anyway. A fair amount of environmental legislation came online under Richard Nixon, so say whatever you will about Watergate, but we did get some environmental things in place under Richard Nixon, including the EPA. When you're looking at this topic, make sure you're covering all the different areas. You've got to think about groundwater, aquifers, drawdown, how does agriculture play into that, surface waters. They're frequently used as drinking sources for municipalities. Obviously, they've got, their environmental use. A lot of states are trying to look at surface waters in a more comprehensive manner these days. Wetlands, of course. You've got your federal oversight of wetlands. At times you have state oversight of wetlands as well. More and more local municipalities are getting into, they don't necessarily step on the feet of the federal and state regulating agencies, but they do worry more about a wetland margin area and trying to minimize impacts in that. One of the things to keep in mind with all these is, again, the spatial aspect. How are these things being planned for differently? Obviously, and if you're in North Carolina and you're in a coastal area, you're worried about a whole different set of environmental issues than if you're up in the mountains of North Carolina. There are several policy guides, waste management, which we also discussed a little bit in our infrastructure slide later, but there's policy guides on water resources, wetlands, endangered species, and habitat management, I believe, are the same policy guide. If you're unfamiliar, if you've worked in environmental quite a bit, the exam probably doesn't include too much that you haven't already dealt with. If you haven't worked in environmental planning, definitely consult these policy guides and get up to speed on them. Again, linking back to the case law, the TVA versus Hill in 1978, that essentially validated the Endangered Species Act and how it really needed to be carried out as opposed to how the government was carrying it out prior to that time. Rapanos versus the U.S. in 2006 is more recent, and that basically pulled back the Army Corps of Engineers definition of wetlands. So that's important to understanding how wetlands can be regulated through the federal government at least. Different people, books they might have written. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was an early publication that pointed out the dangers of pesticide and chemical use and set a lot of things into motion. Ian McHarg's Design with Nature was a more planning document, essentially how you can plan your development and not completely obliterate the site that you're working on. But both of those are important to be familiar with for the exam. I have a sample question here, which if you joined us last week, this will look familiar to you. But if you're new, this will be a new question to you. Again, I'm going to read through this whole question and then launch the poll because the poll does not include the full language. It just doesn't fit in the polling feature. An urban municipality has received grant funding to restore riparian buffers in order to improve the untreated water quality of the municipality's public water, which is drawn partially from surface waters. Which of the following steps is not necessary to get the project underway? A. Research existing databases for information on water quality within the source water's watershed. B. Determine ownership of parcels along surface waters within the municipality. C. Review aerial photography to assess conditions adjacent to waterways within the source water's watershed. D. Research the most effective riparian buffer restoration methods for water quality improvement, such as differing buffer widths and vegetation type. And E. Contact adjacent municipalities that contain any of the source water's watershed. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and launch that. You should be able to see that and respond to that question now. One of the things to keep in mind, this question, I think we had it last week as just a general sample question, but again, it's obviously a functional area. It's talking a lot about water quality and wetlands and things of that nature. It's also a process question, so it's a little bit of plan making. I don't know how APA would ever officially classify something like this. I think they just go with what it seems to be more of. But this is, I think, a very accurate sample question in that it's got a little bit of everything in it, and you've got to use both your technical knowledge and a bit of plan making in that as well. Okay, I think most people, I'm going to give just a few more seconds here for people to finish voting. It's coming in heavily for B with a little bit on the other options, but primarily for B, 80%. So I'm going to go ahead and close that now. And share those results with you just to give you an idea of how everyone voted. And in this case, the important things to look at in this question, which of the following steps is not necessary. So first of all, you're looking for the not necessary part, and to get the project underway. So you are starting this process. So you want to think about what is earlier as opposed to something that could be attended to later. And obviously you're just looking for one item. So you may think, well, that doesn't necessarily need to be done first, but it should be done early. In this case, though, the answer goes more back to what this particular process is about. And this is determine ownership of parcels along all the surface waters in the municipality. It's not necessary to do all the surface waters. At some later point in the process, you may want to know ownership along the surface waters that are tied into the public water draw. But it says in the question that the public water is drawn partially from surface waters. So maybe there's some surface waters in the municipality that have nothing to do with the public water. Perhaps it goes into a different watershed, whatever the case may be. So it's ownership of parcels along all the surface waters is simply not necessary to get the project underway. Yep, see, there you go, B. And just to let you know, and if you've already printed out the slides, you do know this, that the answers are on the slides. We didn't want to fail to provide those for you. Another sample question that I'll launch a poll on: between 1986 and 1997, which of the following activities accounts for the highest percentage of wetlands losses? A, silviculture, B, urban development, C, rural development, D, agriculture. And this is one of those kinds of questions that I am primarily an environmental planner myself, and I remember when I looked at this, I was like, well, all of those seem somewhat realistic to me. It's like, yes, agriculture does a lot of damage, and so does silviculture, and, well, urban development does certainly, and rural development, well, it kind of depends. It depends where you're dividing the line between urban and rural. So this is something that was actually taken out of the policy guide on wetlands. And so this would be going back to something that APA has put out there in their policy guide, which to some degree automatically makes it important. I'll give just a little bit more time for people to respond to that. But this is a case where, like I said, environmental is more my specialty, and I wouldn't have necessarily been certain of this answer right off the top of my head. If I had read the policy guide on wetlands, perhaps I would have retained that information a little bit better. Okay, I'm going to give just a few more seconds and then close that. The opinion on this is a bit more divided than the last question, certainly. Okay, I'm going to close that poll and then share it with you. About 50% of you went with urban development, and then it was split fairly evenly between rural and agriculture. The answer is B, the urban development. But just so you can get an idea, silviculture is 23% of wetland loss, urban 30%, rural 21%, and agriculture 26%. So you can kind of see that this isn't as distinct as what you might think. And this is a question that we got from the Colorado PDO. When you look online for study resources, there's various things out there, and this just happened to be taken from part of the APA National Conference last year where the Colorado PDO presented, and that whole entire presentation is on the APA website. If you haven't seen it, it's a good thing to take a look at. APA presented, and then Colorado PDO and a couple other people as well. All right, I am going to take a look at questions real quick, just in case anybody had any questions that I can address before I pass it back to Dave. I think I'm going to have to sort through these because there's quite a few. Someone does have a question, and I'll answer this just to get it out of the way. Are the weekly presentations a summary of the PA study notes? No. It just so happened the way that this series worked out, the PA chapter was doing the first 2 sessions. Next week, I believe, actually Marilyn takes over. So from this point forward, we actually really don't have involvement in what the content is week to week. So a difference between a food system and a food shed. A food system more talks about the process of, acquiring seed or whatever it is, and putting it through the process of getting it to market. A food shed is more just like a watershed is. The city of Philadelphia, for example, where is its food actually coming from? And when they map this, they kind of do a kind of percentage. 50% of our food comes from within this geographic boundary. If we move out a little bit further, that captures 70% of our food within this geographic boundary. So the food system is more of a process, and the food shed is a geographic area. I'm going to pass things back to Dave now. Dave just a reminder to try and speak up for people, and Dave has a few slides to go to, and then we'll come back and do some more questions.
All right, looking at infrastructure, there's 3 basic types outside of transportation of infrastructure. And we'll look at those on this slide and then look at transportation separately. The 3 basic types are pipes, wire, and trash. And piped infrastructure includes water, sewer, and gas. There may be a few others out there that get piped as well. But the basics in most of our communities are going to be water, sewer, and gas. You don't need to worry too much about designing a water or sewer system or getting gas distributed. But remember that water is usually on a looped or a grid system to maintain pressure. Water is always pressurized. Sewer doesn't have to be, but it's generally gravity fed, and it'll flow downhill, so to speak. Sewer treatment is in 3 forms. There's primary treatment, secondary treatment, and tertiary treatment. Primary takes the big stuff out. Tertiary takes some of the smaller stuff out, or I'm sorry, secondary takes some of the smaller stuff out, and tertiary makes it almost, if not drinkable again. And that's about the level you need to worry about those 2 types of systems. but remember, water systems tend to be gridded or looped so as to maintain pressure. Sewer systems generally are gravity fed and flow downhill. And again, there's a few exceptions to that, but those are general rules of thumb. In terms of the wire type infrastructure, we have electricity and communications primarily. For electricity, all you really need to understand is the distribution process. It starts at the plant, and it goes through the transmission lines, which are the large wires and the large overhead towers, into a substation, onto distribution lines, which are ones that run along the streets, into a transformer, and then into your house. A lot of utilities will pass out every so often, once a year, once every 2 years, a little brochure that explains how electricity gets distributed. If you can understand that brochure, you pretty much have what you need to know for the exam at least. Communications comes in 3 types of forms that we need to worry about. The wire phone, and even though we're talking about wires, there's now wireless communications, and then there's the internet as well. Just understand basics of how the different systems work. The phone system works from exchanges in areas, and it tends to be analog. The wireless system anymore tends to be digital, as does the internet. The internet works on a packet-based transmission system, and that's about all the further you really need to get with it. There's a lot of detail out there in other sources, but it gets beyond the scope of the exam, at least in our experience. Telecom Act of 1996 and some of the requirements it placed on municipalities in terms of mandating the accommodation of the siting of cell towers. That was a hot topic for a number of years over the last decade or so. Understand that the municipality can't stand in the way of the rollout of the cellular system, of the wireless system. But they do have some control over aesthetics, and they can adjust and tweak some of the siting issues, but they can't get in the way. If a study of the area shows there's a hole in the network and they need to put a tower there to accommodate that hole, they can't say no under the Telecom Act. Also under communications is broadcast media, and just understand that broadcast media is part of communications. That would include TV, radio, and the newspaper, magazine industries. They do impact their land use in terms of they generally have a place of production, which for TV and radio would be the studio. For the newspaper, that's where the press is. They have a means of support, office space, and they also have a means of distribution, which for TV and radio, again, is the antennas, and for newspaper, magazines, newspaper more particularly, would be like paper boxes and the retail stores. For trash, understand the advantages and disadvantages between public and private collection. Collection is about 75% of the cost of our waste disposal system. And you should plan for about 5.5 pounds per person per day when you're setting up a waste disposal system. In terms of the actual disposal site, they are a locally unwanted land use, and that's the area that tends to cause the opposition in the disposal system. Nobody wants that in their backyard, and understandably so. However, everybody wants their trash to be eliminated. Disposal, around here we oftentimes think of landfills, around these parts of Pennsylvania at least. Other areas may see disposal as an incinerator. Those are 2 of the larger ways of disposing of trash, but there's other methods, cogeneration, where they burn the trash and then distribute the heat via steam to surrounding uses, and use that as an offsetter of the costs. And then reuse. There are exchanges out there, waste exchanges out there, that help connect the municipalities with people who would be interested in utilizing the recyclables. Those are becoming more and more prominent as recycling becomes more and more commonplace. We just got a notice here recently, and maybe this puts us behind the times, but we just got a notice out here that the recycling center up the up the mountain is now taking anything with a cord unless it has Freon in it, which is nice because we don't have to worry about throwing all that out anymore. Infrastructure in terms of transportation. There is a long statutory history on transportation and how it developed over the years. Suffice it to say, if you focus on the highlights, 1916 is when the federal government mandated each of the states to develop departments of transportation. 1956 is when the Interstate Highway Program was kicked off, at least legislatively, and 1991 introduced the current era of transportation through the Transportation Enhancement Act, and the three of those that have come since 1991. The MPOs were created in 1973. MPO is a Metropolitan Planning Organization, and they are charged with being fiscally constrained and planning through what's called a Transportation Improvement Program, what projects are going to be advanced, which projects are needed, but they have to be fiscally constrained. The T legislation that started in 1991 and has been, again, subsequently renewed under similar but different names, AICP, Safety Lou, and Next T, but they also require the Transportation Improvement Program, a long-range transportation plan, which the Transportation Improvement Program should be drawn from, and then it also had a very large public input requirement, which was put in place to ensure that the public had its say, not only the people that were directly impacted by maybe having their property taken for a transportation project, but the public in general as to whether or not the community felt that the transportation improvement was needed. Also, with the T legislation, we have safety initiatives and transportation enhancement initiatives, which basically, well, safety is fairly self-explanatory. There's smaller projects like the Safe Routes to School type idea, where you're putting infrastructure in place to, in that case, keep the students out of traffic. Transportation enhancements are things like bike trails or restoring maybe an old train station that has maybe historic significance in the community, but it has to be tied back to transportation somehow. Always think multimodal when you're dealing with transportation, especially as the exam approaches it. There's a multimodal approach concept that seems to pervade. As we think that way, and even as we continue on in our real jobs here, the need for multimodal is increasing. As we look around, there's more and more people. I just look out my window. There's more people walking. They're taking bikes, even to work. We have people that take trains into work that never did before. So the multimodal approach is starting to take hold. Unfortunately, we're seeing our funding shrinking, and that's because we've been successful with some of our initiatives in transportation. We have alternate fuel vehicles now that are taking away from gasoline consumption. We have vehicles that are more fuel efficient that are still using gasoline, but unfortunately our system is still primarily funded with gasoline tax. So as the gasoline use goes down, the funding tends to shrink as well. There are, with the energy and growth management implications, again, we touched on as we convert away from gasoline slowly, but it seems like it's catching on. What is the implication of that? As we go multimodal, what are implications of that? As we go multimodal, people are likely to start living closer into where they're working. On the other hand, as like what we're doing here right now, the connectivity through the internet and maybe phone becomes more and more robust. You may have more people that don't even need the traditional transportation system to get into work. They can sit at home and link in and then go that way. Transportation is also one area that is very much interlinked between local, regional, state, and federal. So consider who plans for what, who has what jurisdictions over the different aspects. And generally, it works best when everybody's working together. When you have the MPO in touch with their localities, the localities are in touch with the MPO. The MPO has a good relationship with the state and the federal government as well, and the state works well with everybody as well. As they take joint consideration into place, it makes that long-range transportation plan and the transportation improvement planning that much easier and brings consensus that much quicker. Okay, we have another sample question. Which of the following is not true about a metropolitan planning organization? A, they are federally mandated for urbanized areas with a population over 250,000. B, they channel federal funds for transportation projects. C, they maintain a long-range transportation plan for a region. D, their decision-making committees can be comprised of a mix of local, state, and federal representatives. So
Okay, I've just launched that one for you, Dave. If people can take a minute to respond to that. And I have one question that came in that is still dealing with MPOs, so I'll ask that now. I believe you noted when MPOs were founded. Can you repeat that date?
I believe it was 1973.
And just a general note for people, most of the information that Dave has, not all of it, of course, but most of it is in the PA chapter's Professional Development Committee study notes, and those are on the website. So if you miss a date or something like that, it's most likely available in that source, since Dave wrote a great deal of that.
That's the transportation part.
Not the transportation part, okay. Give just a few more seconds here for this answer. It's coming in heavily for A, but there's a little bit of dissension among the group, I'll say. I'll give a few more seconds for that and then close that and then share those results. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close that and share it with everybody. Definitely A was the overwhelming favorite, but D still got a fair amount of responses, and B as well. And I'll hide that, and you can go back to your slide and show the answer, Dave.
All right, the answer in this case is A. The population requirement right now is 50,000. It's important to note that even if that were to change, there is talk of changing that number probably as we speak. The exam will not change that quickly. So the current requirement is 50,000, and if something like that were to appear on the exam, even if it changed tomorrow, I don't think they're going to get the pool of questions updated that quick. But that's just an example of some things that may change in the interim, but they would probably throw that out at that point. But it is A, it's 50,000. The rest we do. Blair County Planning Commission here doubled as the MPO for Blair County for the Altoona region. With the 1973 date, as we're going through here, the project we're doing here in the office, our MPO type function actually started back in the early 60s with area transportation plan. But the MPO terminology started in 1973.
Dave, if you can stand to be interrupted, I do want to go over some questions that have come in, since some of them are fairly specific to what you just went over. So before we get too far away from it, let's see, water systems. Someone missed. They can be looped, or what is the other option? Pressurized.
They're looped to be pressurized.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then
or gridded. I think I used the word gridded. It's the same concept. You're not going to see any pipes that just sort of stud off generally. And there's exceptions to everything, but generally every pipe's going to be connected at both ends.
Okay. And you referenced a brochure for infrastructure that people could look at. Do you remember that?
Um,
Well, we'll just have to go back and listen for that one.
yeah, we'll have to go back
Or
and
it might be in the study notes. And also the Wireless Telecommunication Act. Um, when was that again? Did that have a
1996. It was
19,
adopted actually in 95. It's called the Telecom Act of 96.
the Telecom Act of 1996? Okay. And then Trigen. What is Trigen?
Cogen. Cogeneration.
Cogeneration. Okay.
That's
Can you explain cogeneration a little bit?
generally where you're burning off something. Over in this area, it tends to be burning off waste coal slag and then distributing the heat that results from that process, distributing the heat to local surrounding properties. So you're burning off the waste and then distributing the heat. And sometimes when you're burning off the heat, you can produce power with it as well.
Okay. And then there was a question that came in on the Section 106 process, and I will address that. Section 106, as I said, is part of the 1966 Historic Preservation Act, and essentially that put into place that is if there is a federal action or a federal permit or if the feds have to get involved in your project at all. And funding can trigger that. As well as a permit requirement, or if the federal agencies are doing the project themselves. And obviously, a really well-known example of that is a transportation agency, a state transportation agency. Obviously, they're getting federal funds for their projects for the most part, so they have to follow Section 106. But again, if you require a permit from the Clean Water Act, you have to look at historic resources and impacts on that. So that Section 106 process is triggered by any type of federal involvement, really. Federal funding, federal permit, federal agency as the lead in the project itself. And essentially they have to look at historic structures or potential historic structures, and that is anything over 50 years old, and determine if they are indeed historic. And then if so, is the potential project going to impact them? And if the answer is yes to that, then okay, what can you do to not impact them? And essentially that sets up process of looking at the impacts on the historic structure versus impacts that may result from avoiding the historic structure entirely. And it can get fairly involved as to the ending point. If you have a very minimal impact on the historic structure, but you still need to have that in order to not entirely wipe out a wetland, for example. The federal agencies will, and the state agencies will kind of go back and forth on that. But that is the Section 106 process. Essentially look at any potential historic structure, figure out if you're going to have impacts, and then figure out how to entirely avoid. If you can't avoid, then certainly minimize, and then if you can't do that, then you've got to mitigate the impacts to the historic structure. Dave, I think I'll send it back to you to continue on with the presentation, okay?
All right, institutional facilities. Basically schools, correctional institutions, military installations. Just understand the impacts those tend to have on the communities, especially when it comes to colleges and correctional institutions. Colleges do tend to identify a community when they're located there. You just think of your stereotypical college town. With the primary and secondary schools, some things to consider for the exam. Public schools make up 90% of the national enrollment, and dropout rates have been decreasing for the last 40 years, but enrollment generally has remained steady. There's been a couple of dips, but overall it's been relatively steady. The correctional institutions also present some unique challenges to their host community, just both, number one, on perception, number two, what happens if there's a breach of security. But also with correctional institutions, there's different types. It's not just the penitentiary type, but we also have juvenile halls. There's military prisons, psychiatric hospitals, maybe state wards, things like that. Our U.S. inmate population has tripled since 1982, and we have the highest incarceration rate in the world. We have 2.2 million people in the system as of 2006. Also, with military installations, again, there's an impact on that community. They have economic support, but there's also a social impact that's associated with that, that comes up once in a while, where somebody goes off base and maybe does something that they shouldn't be doing. But the economic support that those bases bring to their host communities is overwhelming in some cases. People don't realize how many nooks and crannies it gets into. In terms of reuse, each reuse concept needs to be unique to the jurisdiction in which the base is located, and it can be ranged from anything to meeting housing needs to installing a new transportation setup, depending on what the need of the community is. Economic development is based on business attraction and retention, and also workforce attraction and retention. And that's something that's coming in relatively new over the last 5 years. The second is to try to negate the effects of the brain drain, people moving out because they feel there's no opportunity locally. But it's also brought in a new concept of crossing economic development with community development, because the younger generations tend to pick where they want to live, and then they worry about picking up their job. The business attraction and retention, you do some studies, and we'll look at that in the next slide here. And then there's also real estate issues that can be dealt with as well in terms of industrial parks or incubators. Quantitative functions we will skip today because there's a whole session on that later on in the series. And revitalization, we've gone over somewhat with the urban renewal program, but it's basically removing the old derelict buildings that don't have real use anymore and replacing them, and also making sure there's a social and economic backing to them to give some identity and some funding to them. This slide as well, we're going to...
Dave, can I just interrupt you for just a second? If you could flip to the last two slides, and what we'll do is we'll show those slides just to go over those a little bit, and then we'll come back and touch on these last couple slides. You want to do that?
Yep.
Because we're officially at our ending point now, so just for everyone to get through this part anyway, the slides do have this information. Again, this presentation is up on the PA chapter website right now. It was up there yesterday. You go to planningpa.org, and then the Career Center and the AICP exam page. We've got a lot of things on there. The slides from today's sessions, and then also the study notes that we've been referring to at various points in time.
There they are.
Yes, there it is. Like I said, we've got
under here.
We've got some general tips. We have an in-person session in Pennsylvania next Saturday, actually, if anybody's that close to Pennsylvania that they want to attend. That's like a 9 to 4 type thing. We talk about this webinar series. We have some past presentations on the page, and then we have the different slides on there. So that's all on the PA chapter page. It includes the study notes. Other comprehensive sources, just to kind of put that out for you if you're wondering about that, I would say the Planetizen AICP exam preparation course is very comprehensive. The APA exam prep 2.0 is very comprehensive. One thing the study notes don't have is a a practice exam that you can sit at your computer and test yourself in a similar fashion to what the actual test format is. Planetizen has that, and the exam prep has that. Planetizen overall is interactive. You can send questions into somebody and get answered. Um, and then on the next slide, we have the link to the policy guides down at the bottom of that. And this just gives you an example of the type of information that can be in the policy guide that's just kind of important to know. And then on our last slide, we have the contact information for me and for Dave. Next week's topic is public participation in social justice. You can register for that off the PA chapter website, and then also I think the other participating chapters as well, but certainly the PA chapter has it as well. The presentations are archived. Apparently they have not gone up yet on the Utah chapter, but the recordings with the slides will be on the Utah chapter at that link. And then the slides are already on the PA chapter page. So any questions, certainly you can email us, but definitely check the PA chapter AICP exam page for resources and slides, and then the Utah chapter site as well. And I do think it's going to take us a week or so to put the recordings up in general. And regarding next week's presentation, the PA chapter is not doing that. I did try and check to see when if the slides would be posted in advance, and unfortunately did not get an answer for that. But I would check the North Carolina chapter website or also the Maryland chapter website, and it's possible it could be in either one of those locations. So Dave, if you want to go ahead and go back and we'll finish the content areas. I think we really only had like 4 content slides, but we'll certainly go over those for those who can stick with us. Okay?
Yeah. All right. With the analysis and forecasts for economics, always question the data, and it's not necessarily questioning whether it's a valid data set. I would hope that we're all to the point where we can recognize that. But it's to ensure you have the correct data set, and the data is actually going to answer the questions that you're asking of it. Is the data going to support what you really need to find out in order to give you a good answer? And also, is historic analysis actually possible with the data if a historic analysis is actually needed? Economic base analysis is basically dividing the economy into 2 basic sectors: basic, which is anything that's exported, and non-basic, which is anything that stays local. Concept of basic would be products that are made and then shipped away, whether it be agricultural or maybe heavy metal, things like that. Non-basic is stuff that stays local, your convenience stores, your grocery stores, things of those natures. The advantage to it is it's very easy and straightforward, but it assumes the basic sector drives the economy, which may or may not be true, especially as we move into an information age. There are different approaches to take. If you're one that's been around a while and have a good touch with your community, you can take the empirical approach, which basically is local knowledge of the area and of the industries that are being done. But when you do that, you got to make sure you know what your own assumptions are and take them into account. Then you can do a minimum requirement approach, which calibrates your work with the work of another region that's similar to you, just sort of helps keep you honest, so to speak. And then you can also do a location quotient approach, which is basically taking and quantifying a little more, and shows you how much is local share and how much is national or regional share. The fiscal impact analyses, there's several of them. There's input-output analysis. There's net present value, which shows the actual net value of a project, but it brings it back. The project may take several years. It takes the pricing and brings it back to the current value. Benefit and cost analysis, not to be confused with cost-revenue analysis, but benefit cost analysis is the monetary value of a project, and comparing it to the monetary values of alternate competing projects. There's also cost effectiveness analysis, which you compare two projects that will provide similar benefits and see which one's the better deal. And then there's also cost revenue analysis, which estimates the costs and revenues that a project will bring to a community. Know those three basic formulas that are there: the location quotient, floor area ratio, economic base multiplier. I'm going to make the assumption they're going to go over those in the quantitative session. If not, they are in the notes. So if it gets missed there, you can look it up in the notes. Differences in terminology between, like, and this is just an example, between neighborhood shopping center, community, regional shopping center. Each has basic assumptions with it. For instance, your neighborhood shopping center, it's going to draw people from a very tight ring. It's going to be relatively small, and it might have maybe a corner grocery store type idea in it, up to the regional shopping center, which is going to draw people maybe from counties away, going to be on a huge tract of land, and they have several department stores in it, things like a mall type idea. So the different scales and all like that will be on the exam. Do we still want to do questions?
Oh, I think we'll just, you can go through this one. We won't launch this poll, just for time purposes.
Okay. The total area of permitted floor space expressed as a proportion of the site is known as the A, gross leasable area, B, location quotient, C, floor area ratio, or D, AICS. And that's one of those that I would call a give-me question. You're either going to know it or not, although if you read the context of this, you see floor space up in the question, proportion to the site, proportion is a ratio, so you would come up with the letter C in that case. Gross leasable area is the area of a building that can produce revenue. Location quotient we went through on the last slide. AICS is actually a classification system. This slide will go very quickly because a lot of this will come up, has either come up in other slides or will come up in subsequent presentations in the series. Basically, again, make sure you're questioning your data. You can get sources from federal statistics like Transportation Research Board or the Labor Department, the Census, places like that. But again, will the data supply the accurate answer for your question? Will it actually produce the results you need it to? The skills of the community can be ascertained either empirically. Again, you have a good knowledge of the community and you know what it is. It can be surveyed to determine a specific skill set, whether it's present or not, or it can be quantified, which is the results of some of the studies we just went over on the previous slide. And then workforce characteristics is a combination of demographics, housing conditions, and skill knowledges. It includes things like income and commute patterns, age distributions, median age, skill types, things like that. But I don't want to get too much into that because it's taken care of elsewhere. Social and health services. Basically, what we need to understand here is how they're distributed. The federal and state do the programs and the funds. There should be a hyphen there. Federal and state do programs and funds. They have a larger tax pool, and they're able, therefore, to amass that larger amount of money and provide the funding, and they also provide the program. The program's provided at that level to provide consistency across the board. In terms of local and local regional, they administer the programs. Generally, these programs are developed at the high levels and then pushed on the lower levels for administration, but that's done because the local people understand where the funds could be best used to meet the needs of the program, the purposes of the program, the needs of the people. Health systems planning. This has faded since the 70s, but given some recent legislation last year, this may be coming back, but it's essentially eliminating or reducing either duplication of service or gap in supply to ensure an efficient delivery of medical dollars, and also an efficient distribution of doctors and nurses. It looks at a continuum of care. It looks at caring for people from cradle to grave, not necessarily individually, but the proportions, making sure each proportion or each element of the population is served. The list there is just to get you thinking about how things are interrelated. I'm not going to be touching on them. And I think that's, yeah, we've done those two. So we're at the questions.
Okay. We only had a couple questions that were not addressed yet. A couple more examples of policy versus comprehensive planning. I believe that goes back to almost your first slide, Dave.
Mm-hmm. A comprehensive plan tends to focus regionally or within the entire jurisdiction, and it attempts to pull in just about every conceivable element that may affect the community. So, for instance, if I am planning for City X, I'm going to do a comprehensive plan that goes from border to border, north, south, east, and west, and I'm going to pull every conceivable thing that may impact that community into consideration in that plan. So that'll include land use, it'll include transportation, it'll include the facilities that are in the community, it'll include the history of the community.
Sorry.
It'll include the environmental side of the community, what are the goals and the opportunities, and then it will develop those goals and those resources so that and provide a direction for the community decision makers and those that are interested in the community to gauge themselves against as they move forward to achieving the goals in the plan. Whereas a policy plan is more specific. It may be that as things are moving forward, we realize there's a need for housing for a certain element of the population. Perhaps there's a need for battered women, then we're not meeting the need for shelters or for housing for them. A policy plan will look at that need very specifically, maybe pull in some extra elements from outside that specific need, develop a policy, and help to implement to meet that need on the short term.
Okay. Other than that, we're just getting kind of a general question. People are asking about the APA 2.0 versus the Planeta Zen course. I think both of them are good sources. Planeta Zen is more interactive. Like I said, you can send questions into people. There will be other test takers studying the same time as you, so I think you can also chat back and forth with them. So that is one thing that the Planeta Zen has that the APA does not have. Both, however, do include the practice exams, which is really useful. And the APA 2.0, I would also recommend that people check with their chapter and see if you can borrow it. I know the Pennsylvania chapter makes it available to our members to borrow, but we only have, I think, one, maybe two copies. So that's why we have to restrict it to our members. But I know other chapters, some at least, do the same. So you can borrow that resource perhaps rather than have to go buy it yourself. Otherwise, I think we are pretty well wrapped up. I want to thank Dave for presenting and thank everybody for joining me. Again, the slides are on the PA chapter site. The recording, if available, should go up on the Utah chapter site in about a week or so. Next week's session is the public participation in social justice. And I'm not sure where those slides will be available in advance, if at all, but hopefully so. Hopefully so. We also have a survey that you can complete when you log out that helps us improve future sessions. And I don't believe we really have any leftover questions that we have to go through after the fact. We did pretty much get through everything. So thanks to everybody for participating today, and good luck on the exam. Dave, I think you need to either end the webcast for us or you can send it back to me and I can do that.
There you go.
Thank you. All right. Bye.
Bye.